Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the strangest chapters in American history. When you think of early colonial America, especially a place like Salem, Massachusetts, you probably picture cozy little towns, crisp autumn leaves, church bells ringing in the distance, kids bobbing for apples, and neighbors sharing pie recipes and moral advice. A simpler time, right? Straight out of a Thanksgiving decoration catalog. But in 1692, this quaint little Puritan town turned into something closer to a high-stakes improv game where the winner was whoever accused someone first. It was like Judge Judy met ghost stories with fewer facts and more fainting. So here's the twist. Would you survive a single day in a town where a weird dream, a burnt muffin, or a sneeze in the wrong direction could get you accused of witchcraft? Let's find out. And before you say I'd be fine, I'd keep my head down. Just remember, these were the same people who put dogs on trial. People who thought dancing, reading, or being too good at baking could mean you were cozying up to the devil. No soft pajamas, no heated blankets, just cold wooden floors, strict neighbors, and a nightly fear that your cat might accidentally get you sentenced to death. Honestly, if you talk in your sleep or have seasonal allergies, you're already on thin ice. So yeah, you might not make it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the videos and subscribe, but only if you actually like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up every morning and checking not the weather but the neighbors just to see who looked like they might be harboring a demon in their root cellar. People were so on edge they'd flinch if a squirrel looked at them too long. It was like living in a never-ending game of hide and seek, except no one was hiding and everyone was seeking a reason to panic. In Salem, superstition didn't whisper, it shouted in your face while wearing a pointy hat. And the funny part, this all happened in a town that was supposed to be deeply religious, but somehow in the name of purity, they created the most impressively absurd paranoia parade in America history. Let's start with the basics. People believed witches were real, not just spooky ghost story real, not Halloween costume real, real. And not only were witches real, they were apparently everywhere. In the bakery, in the well water, in your dreams, in your mother-in-law, okay? That one might have been true, depending on the mother-in-law. So what did a witch even look like? According to the town's collective imagination, someone who talked too much or too little, someone who had a mole or no mole, someone who danced when there was no music or who didn't dance at all. Basically, being a little too happy or a little too sad was highly suspicious. Laughing at a funeral witch, crying at a birthday party, also witch. Let's not forget the dreaded female who knows how to read. That was peak witch behavior. And you'd think the local leaders would calm things down. But no. The town ministers were like human-sized alarm bells, constantly ringing, panicking, sweating under their woolen collars. One particularly excitable minister, Reverend Paris, seemed convinced that the devil had a rental property right outside his church. He believed Satan had packed his bags, hopped the Atlantic, and moved to Massachusetts just to ruin Paris's week. Now Paris had a niece, young Betty. One morning she woke up and didn't feel like doing chores. Instead of faking a headache like a normal 9-year-old, she screamed something about witches rolled on the floor and launched Salem into a spiritual panic attack that lasted months. People didn't just panic, they organized their panic, like printed handouts and held town meetings, level panic, and oh, the symptoms of bewitchment. They ranged from sleepwalking totally normal to shrieking about invisible cats, less normal. One girl claimed she saw a shadow man sitting on a dresser eating her breakfast porridge. And the town went, "Yes, that sounds very real and concerning. Let's burn someone," instead of stopping to ask, "Hey, are we sure this isn't just puberty?" They asked. "How quickly can we build a gallows?" But let's zoom out a second. Why were they so obsessed with witches in the first place? Well, to be fair, life was rough. You worked sunup to sundown, your food was bland, your shoes were mostly made of sadness, and you lived in constant fear of things like wolves' disease and butter going rancid. So when anything went wrong, crops died, kids got fevers, pies didn't bake. It felt better to blame it on someone else, preferably someone weird or independent or unmarried, past the age of 25. Salem was basically one giant anxiety group chat with no admin. Now don't get me wrong, these weren't evil people. They weren't cartoon villains twisting their mustaches. They were just tired, scared, and doing their best with the limited knowledge and maximum superstition they had. But the combination of boredom, fear, and a complete misunderstanding of science, that was deadly and a little hilarious. By the time you got to breakfast, you might already be accused of cursing someone's muffins. By lunchtime, people would start avoiding you in the market. And by sunset, someone would be whispering about how your left eye twitched during prayer, and clearly that's the devil knocking. Now buckle up, because it's only going to get sillier from here. Let's talk about the signs. In Salem, absolutely everything could be a sign that someone was in cahoots with Satan. Stub your toe. That was the work of the devil. Milk go sour. That was because Goody Maples looked at your cow funny last Thursday. One woman, honest to God, was accused of witchcraft because she baked a pie that was too delicious. People thought she had to be using dark powers to make a crust that flaky. Another was questioned because her garden bloomed a little too early in spring. Clearly unnatural, said one neighbor, while holding a turnip that looked like it had been cursed by climate confusion. And the problem with signs was they never stopped coming. A dog howled at the moon witch. Your husband talked in his sleep witch. Your baby sneezed 3 times in a row, triple witch. Soon the townsfolk developed a sixth sense for nonsense. The village blacksmith, who previously only cared about horseshoes and his lunch, suddenly had strong opinions about spiritual possession. He claimed that any woman who walked past his shop and didn't say good morning must be hexing his tools. Meanwhile, the town baker insisted that his burnt loaves weren't his fault. It was his neighbor's evil aura messing with the oven temperature. Honestly, even the goats started to look nervous. And let's not forget the tests, because what's a witch panic without wildly unscientific tests? There was the famous swimming test, where they'd toss a suspected witch into a freezing pond tied up like a ham. If she floated, she was a witch. If she sank, well, oops. Either way, justice was served wet and very cold. Then there was the witch cake. Stay with me here. The townsfolk would bake a cake using rye flour and the afflicted person's urine. Yes, they fed it to a dog, believing that if the dog reacted oddly, it meant the dog was somehow connected to the witch or could reveal her identity. All that cake accomplished was a very confused dog and the most unsanitary bake-off in American history. One particularly creative test involved poking someone with a needle to see if they had a witch's mark, which in plain English meant a mole, a birthmark. or any freckle that didn't look boring enough. If the person didn't flinch, witch. If they did flinch, still probably a witch, just one who flinched. The town doctor at the time, a man whose most advanced medical tool was a spoon, confirmed many of these diagnoses. He once wrote in his notes, "Patient screams when pinched. Likely bewitched." Sir, that is just being human. Even more absurd, the way the court handled testimonies. Spectral evidence was allowed. That means if someone said they had a dream about you turning into a raven and pecking their chimney, that was evidence. Real, admissible courtroom evidence. If a teenage girl cried, "I saw Goody Proctor's spirit poking me in the night," the court might nod solemnly and go, "Ah, yes, very damning." At one point, a man was accused because he refused to attend the trials. They thought it meant he had something to hide. He claimed he just didn't want to watch neighbors get yelled at for having weird eyebrows. Honestly, a reasonable stance. And don't forget the hysteria bonus round, where people began turning on each other at lightning speed. Friends turned on friends. Husbands accused wives. Children were testifying against their own parents, like they were auditioning for a drama club. One 10-year-old claimed her mom turned into a chicken. When asked to explain further, she simply said, "She made that clucking noise when she was mad." Everyone nodded like this was deeply serious information. Salem was quickly becoming a full-on game show called Who Wants to Be a Witch? The prize. A wooden cell, some suspicious bread, and a very public trial in which grown adults earnestly debated whether your cat was plotting against them. And the fashion, oh the fashion, was all shades of itchy. Cloaks, bonnets, layers of wool that trapped every scent from your walk to the outhouse. If the devil was present, he was surely offended by the smell alone. Meanwhile, outside observers, other colonies were starting to look at Salem like the one cousin who keeps posting cryptic status updates. You know the type, "had soup today." The soup knows. And everyone else is like, "Should we be concerned?" Salem didn't care. They doubled down. They started creating charts of behavior diagrams of suspicious glances and logs of who walked past whose barn at which hour. One man made a literal map of his neighbor's unholy footprints. It was just muddy shoe prints, but to him it was conclusive proof of dark magic and maybe bad arch support. Another woman was accused after she knit a pair of mittens without a pattern. Witchcraft, they whispered as she tried to explain that she just memorized it. Too suspicious? Even the weather got in on the paranoia. One foggy morning, the clouds drifted too low and someone shouted, "The spirits are descending." No, sir, that is humidity, but good enthusiasm. What's truly amazing, what makes this all so tragically funny, is how normal frustrations became life or death situations. Burn your stew, witch. Argue with your neighbor, witch. Be in the wrong place when someone else stubbed their toe. You're a witch. Congratulations. And through it all, the town was somehow both terrified and entertained. Yes, people were scared, but they also loved a bit of drama. Salem was the original reality show. Suspicious glances, dramatic gasps, wild accusations, and weekly eliminations. All it was missing was a theme song. If reality TV existed in 1692, Salem would have won an Emmy for Best Ensemble Panic. By now, Salem wasn't just suspicious, it was practically hallucinating. Let's talk about the afflicted girls. You know, the ones who screamed, flopped on the floor, and claimed they saw shapes and specters and floating teapots of doom. Okay, maybe not the teapot part, but you get the idea. These girls, mostly teenagers, became local celebrities. People would gather just to watch them convulse and yell, "She pinched me with her invisible claw." It was like interpretive dance meets mass hysteria. At one point, one girl claimed she saw a ghost biting her elbow. Another said a spirit sat on her head and sang psalms backward. The judges nodded solemnly. Salem was apparently allergic to common sense, and it wasn't just kids. Adults got swept into it too. A grown man testified that a woman turned into a yellow bird and pecked at his soul. When asked to elaborate, he just said, "It felt very bird-like." The court accepted this with the gravity of a NASA briefing. Meanwhile, the accused witches, most were just regular folks, farmers, housewives, a midwife who had the audacity to successfully deliver babies. Some were elderly women with strong opinions and not enough teeth. Others were quiet neighbors who once said, "I don't like jam," and were never trusted again. One woman got accused because she wore black too often. Another because she talked to her cat like it understood her. Spoiler alert, every cat owner is guilty of this. If that's witchcraft, half the internet's going to jail. At one point, a man named Giles Corey, who was in his 80s, refused to enter a plea in court. He knew the system was broken and wouldn't play along. So what did they do? They laid heavy stones on his chest to encourage him to speak. His final words: "More weight." That's right. In the middle of this tragic circus, the man served up legendary sass. He died without giving in. A proper middle finger to Salem's nonsense delivered under literal pressure. Meanwhile, the judges and ministers were thriving in their ridiculousness. Judge Hathorne was the kind of guy who probably sniffed milk and declared it demon-tainted if it smelled even slightly off. He once grilled a woman for blinking suspiciously fast during questioning. Another judge asked a man if he dreamed about goats, and somehow that became a full accusation. The town records from this era are so absurd, it's hard to believe they weren't written as satire. One transcript reads, question: "Did you or did you not turn into a wolf and bite the fence?" Answer: "I am not a wolf." Suspicious: "Take her away." You couldn't win. Deny the accusation, you were lying. Confess you were guilty. Say nothing, guilty and uncooperative. Say too much, guilty and probably French. Salem created a perfect loop of lunacy where logic went to die and paranoia packed a picnic. And let's not forget about the spectacle of the trials themselves. They weren't quiet affairs. People showed up early to get good seats. Kids brought snacks. Someone probably sold popcorn if popcorn had been invented. It was the 17th century equivalent of binge-watching your favorite scandalous show, except the actors were your neighbors, and the stakes were execution. Oh, and the gallows. It had a schedule. Tuesdays were popular, sometimes Thursdays if the week was feeling particularly suspicious. People made vague statements like "bad energy this week," and suddenly 3 more people were arrested. There were even fashion trends that emerged. Little anti-witch charm here, a clove of garlic necklace there. One man walked around with a bundle of dried thyme pinned to his hat and told people it helped him see spirits before they got close. Someone else swore by carrying a potato in his sock. Another wore shoes backward to confuse dark forces. Honestly, dark forces probably were confused. Like, why is everyone walking funny? Children played games where they pretended to accuse each other. One game involved blindfolding someone and guessing which witch pinched them. If they guessed wrong, they were probably a witch too. Salem was officially so far gone it looped back around to absurd comedy. Even pets weren't safe. Dogs were hanged. Yes, dogs. For acting bewitched. I'm not sure what that means. Did the dog chase its tail in a suspiciously counterclockwise direction? Did it bark in Latin? Who knows? Somehow all of this continued for months. The prisons overflowed. Food supplies dwindled. People forgot what they were even mad about. It was like a very long, extremely grim improv show. No one could stop. And then finally, cracks started to show. One judge quietly said, "Maybe we've made a mistake." He was promptly ignored. Another said, "Maybe spectral evidence isn't real evidence." That got him a side eye from the reverend. But the tipping point came when the governor's own wife was accused. Suddenly the entire witch hunt didn't seem so fun anymore. Funny how that works. Trials slowed. Executions stopped. People looked around and realized they'd been on a collective bender of fear and theatrical nonsense. It was like waking up from a long nap and discovering you'd burned down your neighbor's shed because he once sneezed near your mailbox. The spell quite literally broke, but the damage it stayed. 19 people hanged, one crushed, dozens jailed, lives ruined, all because of gossip guesses and a cultural allergy to common sense. And yet from a distance, especially centuries later, it's hard not to squint through the tragedy and see just how ridiculously human it all was. We're messy creatures. We panic. We believe the weird kid is secretly a crow. We make terrible decisions in bulk, especially when everyone else is making them too. But we also learn, sort of. After the hysteria cooled and the air stopped smelling like burnt time and regret, Salem faced what can only be described as the world's most awkward morning after. Imagine waking up and realizing you accused your cousin of consorting with Satan because she gave you side-eye during a prayer. You stood in a courtroom and nodded solemnly as a teenager screamed, "There's a ghost poking my ankle. You helped convict a baker because his croissants were too fluffy." Yeah, that's what Salem was dealing with. People started mumbling apologies at the market like, "Sorry I testified against you. I was possessed by social pressure." And others would reply, "No worries. I was possessed by cinnamon that day." It was an emotional cleanup effort, except no one really had emotional vocabulary in 1692, so most of it was just extended eye contact and giving each other root vegetables as peace offerings. Let's not forget that the jail was still full of people who had been locked up for things like owning 3 cats not blinking enough or smiling during a thunderstorm. Slowly, those people were released, some bitter, some exhausted, and most very hungry. And now the town faced a new challenge: how to pretend this didn't happen. But it had happened, in full view, with full participation. There were records, written testimonies, the kind of things you can't just uncarve out of town history. So they tried the classic human move, rewrite the narrative. Suddenly folks who had been front row center at every witch trial were like, "Well, I always thought it was a bit over the top." And the same judges who used to shout, "Guilty of spectral mischief," started gently hinting, "Maybe we should take up knitting instead." Meanwhile, others doubled down. You had your diehards who refused to admit anything went wrong. They'd say things like, "We didn't hang innocent people. We hung people who made us feel spiritually itchy." And then they'd walk away clutching their rosemary bundles tighter than ever. And let's not forget the awkward Sunday services. Imagine being in church, trying to focus on your sermon while sitting next to a woman you very recently accused of turning your butter rancid through evil telepathy. You both hum the same hymn, glancing sideways, wondering if forgiveness is included in the lyrics. To break the tension, people started holding healing events, town picnics, group prayers, and a truly chaotic festival of fresh starts that featured way too many turnips and a goat dancing contest that no one asked for. There was even a play performed by the local children called Oops All Witches. It was not well received, Still, the embarrassment lingered like a fog. Some families moved away hoping to escape the shame. Others stayed and refused to discuss the incident, referring to it only as that time when everyone was a little spiritually over-caffeinated. But Salem did what humans always do after a mess. They normalized it. They built stories around the story. We were scared. We were tricked. We were trying to protect our souls. And slowly, with every retelling, the absurdity dulled just enough to become palatable. A grim memory filed under, "We don't talk about that at dinner." But the thing is, the witch trials weren't just some fluke. They were a mirror. A deeply uncomfortable, slightly warped mirror that showed what fear looks like when dressed up as righteousness. Because here's the secret no one likes to admit. It wasn't about witches. It was about control. It was about how people respond when their world feels shaky, when crops fail, when wars loom, when diseases spread and futures blur. People want something to blame. And if that something looks a little different or acts a little strange, well, that's all the excuse they need. It's easier to burn a neighbor than admit you're terrified of things you don't understand. So Salem burned, not with fire and pitchforks, but with the slow choking burn of misplaced certainty. A town so convinced of its own virtue it swallowed logic whole, and yet it's still a little funny. Not the tragedy, that's never funny, but the mechanics of it, the spirals of overthinking, the herbal socks, the courtroom chicken dreams. That's the part that's so deeply painfully human. Because haven't we all at some point tried to find meaning in the meaningless? Tried to make sense of a world that doesn't always make sense? Held on to weird beliefs just because everyone else around us was shouting the same thing? In that way, Salem wasn't some bizarre outlier. It was just extra loud about its confusion. Now, when historians look back, they try to pinpoint why it all happened. Was it religious tension? Economic anxiety? Ergot poisoning in the rye bread? But maybe it was something simpler. People plus fear, boredom, work, hysteria. It's the same equation that gives us viral TikTok trends today. Only back then, the stakes were a little higher than a regrettable dance video. So what's left now? Salem has become a symbol of fear, yes, but also of absurdity. A reminder that even in our darkest moments, we're capable of incredible levels of ridiculousness. And maybe laughter is the best way to honor that memory. Because if you don't laugh at the fact that they put dogs on trial, what even can you do? So now, with the flames of panic extinguished and the trial gallows gathering dust like an unpopular stage prop, Salem found itself in a peculiar kind of silence. Not peace, just that awkward post-spectacle silence, the kind you get after someone accidentally sings the wrong verse of a hymn and everyone tries to pretend it didn't happen. Except in this case, instead of botched hymns, it was 19 hangings and a crushed man. The town felt wobbly, like a table with one short leg that everyone kept pretending was level. Children who used to cry out, "Witch," were now being asked to go back to chores. Teenagers who once performed full-body seizures on courtroom floors now returned to mending socks and avoiding eye contact. And grown-ups who had so confidently declared things like, "I saw Goody Swanson's spirit squeeze a pumpkin," were suddenly very into being quiet and sweeping the same patch of dirt multiple times a day. Let's take a look at Reverend Paris. Remember him? The spiritual hype man of the witch craze. Well, his popularity had taken a nosedive. Where once he was seen as the brave defender of holy morality, now he was the man who cried demon every Tuesday. People stopped sitting near him at dinner. Someone carved "not great" with nuance into his sermon bench. Even his dog avoided him. He started giving increasingly desperate sermons titled things like "Please Stop Giving Me," "That Look," and "We All Make Mistakes." The court officials tried to save face, but they didn't do a great job. One judge wrote a formal apology that was so vague, it might as well have said, "Mistakes were perhaps made in a spiritual context by someone not naming names, but let's all move on." Another sent a basket of apples to one of the families whose daughter had been executed. The card read, "Hope this helps." It didn't. Meanwhile, the witch-related tourism hadn't started yet. That would come centuries later when Salem realized it could profit from its own ridiculousness. But for now, the townsfolk were stuck in a weird emotional stew. Equal parts shame, confusion, and leftover urine cake memories no one wanted to bring up. People began finding ways to laugh it off just a little in hushed whispers, like how one boy claimed his chicken was possessed because it kept pecking his socks, only to burst out laughing before the words were fully out. Or how a group of women at the river started telling ghost gossip in the style of old trials. Did you hear Goody Harper was seen talking to her spinning wheel again? Classic. Careful that spinning wheel might testify. Sarcasm was quietly becoming the town's coping mechanism. Even the marketplace had new phrases. If someone was acting grumpy, people would say, "Looks like someone's about to summon a storm." If you tripped on a rock, it was, "Oof, cursed again." If someone baked a lumpy pie, you'd mutter, "Better confess now before it's a tribunal." And in some strange way, these jokes were healing, because they allowed people to admit without fully admitting that they'd all been a little ridiculous. There was even a man who painted tiny portraits of the accused and hid them inside hollowed-out turnips. He called it his witch root collection. When asked why, he shrugged and said, "So we don't forget, but also so we do." As time went on, the names of the executed became whispers instead of outcries. The town started printing pamphlets that focused less on the panic and more on rebuilding the spirit of Salem. One included a full page of community reminders like, "Don't believe everything you dream. Moles are not messages from hell. Cats are just cats." A woman named Martha, who had narrowly escaped being accused, began holding weekly gatherings where people would sit in a circle, eat badly baked scones, and just breathe. No ghosts, no shouting, no blaming, just breathing. It was revolutionary. Eventually, the governor issued a decree that basically said, "Let's not do that again." In classic government style, it was vague, formal, and about 6 months too late, but it was something. The real turning point, though, was time. Time dulled the memory, but not the shape. The fear lingered like a stain on wood, not enough to ruin the furniture, but always visible in certain light. Some families passed down stories. Others tried to erase them. A few kept both versions just in case. What no one could deny, though, was the absurdity that had unfolded. The dancing fits, the invisible pinches, the cakes made of bodily fluids, the courtroom debates over whether a sneeze could be evidence of witchcraft, the quiet, accidental comedy of a town unraveling itself and sewing the pieces back together with the emotional intelligence of a wet shoe. In the end, Salem didn't need a ghost story. It had itself. Its history became a kind of bedtime fable, not just for children, but for grown-ups too. A cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, the chaos of conformity, and the hilarity of unchecked hysteria. A reminder that sometimes the scariest monster is just a group of people with too much time, too little reason, and a town full of itchy wool and bad bread. So if you ever visit Salem today, remember this. Behind every ghost tour and Black Cat Magnet is a story of neighbors' nonsense and one very long, very silly witch hunt that tried very hard to be serious and failed magnificently. And now, dear listener, let's talk about the aftershocks, the odd little ripples that wiggled through Salem long after the last accusation was shouted and the last broomstick metaphor was quietly retired. Because while the trials were over, the weirdness had momentum. Take, for example, the local school teacher, Miss Lydia Fogg. She returned to teaching after months of watching her students pretend to be cursed jellyfish in courtrooms. But now, every time a student yawned too dramatically, she flinched. The alphabet lessons had to be restructured after several parents complained that the letter W reminded them too much of witch. A few proposed changing it to W not devil related, which, to be fair, does not roll off the tongue. Then there was the baker, Mr. Thomas Pillar, who had been accused for the suspiciously symmetrical shape of his scones. Post-trials, he returned to business with a new motto just lumpy enough to be safe. He leaned into it, advertised his non-demonic crust pies and his holy breadsticks. Now, with 100% less brimstone, surprisingly business boomed. Meanwhile, one creative teenage girl, Prudence Green, began charging other children a penny each to see her witch-proof closet, which contained a wet sock, a horseshoe, her aunt's broken teacup, and a carrot that looked vaguely like the Reverend's nose. When someone asked her how it worked, she whispered, "It just does." Which ironically was exactly the kind of vague nonsense that started the trials in the first place. The town had turned into a satirical version of itself. People weren't just recovering, they were rebranding. Salem, now filled with post-hysteria, self-awareness, began leaning into the chaos like a sheep, realizing it had invented wool. There were whisperings of commemorative holidays like Witch-Free Wednesday and National We Were All Kinda Dumb Day. But not everyone found it funny. Some still refused to speak of the past, especially the families who had lost loved ones. To them, the new jokes were salt in a still throbbing wound. And that tension between absurdity and tragedy hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't leave. It was the reason town meetings became awkwardly polite, the reason people started using phrases like, "in light of recent historical enthusiasm," instead of "that time we lost our collective minds." It was the reason no one ever looked directly at the gallows hill unless they were very brave or had dropped a turnip near it. Even the animals seemed to know. The goats bleated more cautiously. The cats no longer wandered into courtrooms. Chickens silent, absolutely done with all of it. Still, there was an undeniable truth: Salem had changed. No one really trusted what they saw anymore. And oddly, that was an improvement. Before, a neighbor could raise an eyebrow and get you arrested. Now, if someone said, "I saw Goody Brown turn into smoke," the usual response was, maybe drink some water and take a nap. Suspicion had been replaced with sarcasm and paranoia, swapped out for eye rolls. It wasn't enlightenment, but it was a step toward normal. And the children, they grew up. Some moved away, settled in less dramatic towns like Concord or Ipswich, where the worst thing that happened was someone stealing your goat and returning it slightly cleaner. Others stayed. They became the new teachers, ministers, bakers, and midwives. They taught their children the truth, or at least a version of it about what had happened. Some said it was a sickness, others said it was fear. A few claimed it was the devil after all, but even they said it with a shrug, like they weren't totally convinced. But what really endured, what outlasted the trials and the silence and the lumpy pies, was the story. Salem had become a kind of legend, a cautionary bedtime tale whispered across generations. Don't be too quick to blame, or you might just invent a witch where there is none. And that's the thing about bedtime stories. The best ones are a little silly, a little spooky, and end just before you ask too many questions. And so here we are hundreds of years later, still talking about this tiny town and its very big mistake. Still laughing gently, still wondering how humans could ever be so sure of something that made so little sense. Still telling each other, let's not ever do that again. And maybe we won't. Because history doesn't always repeat. Sometimes it just echoes softly, awkwardly, like a goat, trying to sing. And in those echoes, if we listen carefully, we can hear both the madness and the meaning. And that, my friend, is the strangest truth of all. Now, if you were hoping that Salem quietly moved on, tucked its tail between its Puritan trousers, and never looked back, oh no. You'd be forgetting one thing: humans are historically bad at letting things go, especially when there's gossip involved. See, even after the last gavel thudded and the last phantom goose sighting was dismissed, Salem didn't just pack up its hysteria and file it under whoops. Instead, it lingered. Like an awkward guest at a dinner party, or that one slightly cursed wheelbarrow no one wanted to use anymore, but also refused to throw away. People still talked, though, now with the forced casualness of someone who's definitely still traumatized. You'd hear things like, "Oh, remember when Abigail claimed her neighbor's sneeze smelled like brimstone? Ha ha. Ha. Wild times." Or didn't someone accuse a fence of whispering yes? But in fairness, it was a particularly suspicious fence. It became this bizarre blend of repression and ritual. For instance, every year, around the anniversary of the first arrest, some townspeople would accidentally leave out extra garlic or sage in their windows, muttering just in case. Just in case what? The trials made a comeback like a bad haircut. Others would do the opposite, overcorrect so hard it hurt. One man, Ezekiel Button, insisted that nothing supernatural had ever happened in Salem, including his wife's famous levitating pie crusts. Just air bubbles, he grunted, while the pie clearly hovered 6 inches above the dish. And then, of course, there were the witch hipsters, the ones who claimed they always thought the trials were silly, even though everyone remembered them screaming in court, "I saw her riding a raccoon through the night sky." These folks now gave lectures in the tavern titled things like "The Sociology of Moral Panic," a retrospective by someone who definitely didn't participate. The town even tried to redesign its image. There was talk of building a new town square to symbolize a fresh beginning. The plan included a fountain shaped like a giant handshake and benches engraved with phrases like, "Let's think next time," and "Fewer trials, more trust." Unfortunately, the fountain leaked, and the benches gave everyone splinters, which some blamed on, you guessed it, leftover witch energy. But if you want to understand how deep the scars ran, look no further than the children of the trial era. These kids had grown up during the most ridiculous emotional roller coaster in American colonial history. They'd watched neighbors float in ponds, adults scream about invisible birds, and entire families torn apart over biscuit-based accusations. So naturally, they grew up with a very particular kind of humor. These were the kids who invented the game Witch Goat, or Honest Mistake, a charades-style activity where players had to guess if someone's weird behavior was due to supernatural possession, farm animal interference, or just a poorly timed sneeze. They wrote mock trial scripts to perform in the barn. They carved pumpkins with trial judge faces. They dared each other to touch haunted rocks while reciting the phrase, "more weight," with theatrical groans. Their parents disapproved, but mostly because they didn't like being reminded. Even schooling took on an odd twist. One teacher tried to remove the letter W from the alphabet lessons altogether, calling it too emotionally complicated. Another banned the color black during winter term. When questioned, she replied, "It's just better this way." And so Salem became a living museum of quiet contradictions. By day it was industrious and practical, rebuilding, replanting, restitching what had been torn. But by night, it whispered. Not because ghosts were real, but because the memory of what people had believed felt louder than any ghost ever could. People started to realize that the true haunting wasn't from witches, it was from their own capacity to believe nonsense with conviction. And that was the kind of thing you couldn't just hang, burn, or bury. But as humans do, they coped. Some turned to humor, others turned to religion again. A few went full-on nature-loving apothecary mode, insisting that tea made from swamp ferns could remove toxic memory clusters. They called themselves rebalanceurs. They wore lavender capes and shouted, "Release the trauma," at their windowsills. One man claimed he could speak to the spirits of wrongly accused turnips. "They just want closure," he said, and compost. And then came the great irony years later. People started asking questions. What actually caused the panic? Were they really bewitched or just really dramatic? Could bad bread have made everyone loopy? Did Reverend Paris just need a nap? Scholars, theologians, amateur historians, and several oddly confident goats all weighed in. Essays were written, town records reviewed, witch cakes dissected under microscopes that didn't exist back then but would have cleared up a lot. Eventually, Salem became known less for the trials themselves and more for what they said about people. People under pressure, people in tight clothes with not enough fiber in their diet, people with so much fear and so little understanding that they looked into a mirror, saw confusion, and blamed it on someone else. People, in short, not unlike us, because here's the quiet, weird truth. If you take away the corsets and the pointy hats, if you remove the archaic spelling and the firewood-powered courtrooms, you're left with a bunch of regular folks doing what humans do best, panicking creatively. And maybe that's the legacy that really matters, not the ghosts, not the curses, not even the levitating pie crusts, but the sheer, relentless oddness of being human. As the years passed, Salem's witch trials settled into history like a bad haircut you keep seeing in old portraits. Unfortunate, yes, but also a little hilarious once you're no longer living through it. But in town, the memories clung like stale smoke. By now, entire generations had grown up post-trials, and yet somehow the vibe never fully left. You could feel it in how people paused before saying something a little too clever, or how no one ever named their child Abigail anymore, for fear it might bring back the ghost of unsolicited theatrics. And while most of the town tried to keep things calm, there was always that one neighbor who couldn't help themselves, like Harold Buckminster, who walked around claiming he could smell a witch from 6 feet away. When pressed for details, he admitted it mostly smelled like soup, gone sour in disappointment. He opened a service called Witch Sniffing by Harold and charged 1 shilling per sniff. Business was inconsistent. Then there was the town council's attempt to create an official Salem wellness plan, which included 1 community bonfire per season, absolutely no effigies allowed, weekly trust your neighbor potlucks, mandatory group affirmation sessions with phrases like, "My neighbor is probably not cursed," The potlucks were fine until someone brought oddly shaped muffins and everyone left early. But behind the awkward tea parties and denial-tinted optimism, the town quietly began grappling with a bigger question. Why had it all happened? Not in the literal, we accused a midwife of turning into a toad way, but in the deeper, itchier, existential way. They began asking things like what made people turn on each other so quickly. Why did everyone believe little girls with bad acting skills? Why did the town believe so fiercely in fear? One schoolteacher, Miss Penelope Goodwin, created a new class called Society and Silliness, a study of Salem's very bad month. Her lessons included shadow puppets, dried herbs, and mandatory apologizing exercises. Her most famous lecture was titled, "Don't Yell Fire," unless there is actual fire, and also maybe check if it's just steam. The children were skeptical at first, but eventually they started asking sharper questions than their parents ever had. One student asked, "If everyone believes something, does that make it true?" Another asked, "If fear makes people mean, how do we stay kind when we're scared?" Penelope cried quietly after class that day and baked a cake shaped like a judge's hat. No one quite understood what it meant, but it was delicious. And that's when something unexpected happened. For the first time in Salem's history, people stopped looking for witches and started looking inward. They examined their traditions, their rules, and most terrifying of all, their dinner conversations. They started noticing how gossip traveled faster than logic, how someone could say, "Did you hear she sings to her chickens?" And by sundown, it had become, "She summons poultry demons with lullabies of darkness." One town meeting was devoted entirely to discussing how rumors grow. It devolved into a dramatic reenactment where 3 grandmothers played the roles of the original truth, slightly spicier version. And ridiculous thing, my cousin's dog said. It was both informative and deeply confusing. By this point, the whole community had developed a delicate awareness of absurdity. They were finally learning that if something sounds too strange to be true, it might be because it is. There was even a town-wide push to rewrite the public records with better context. The official report used to say Goody Thompson was tried for bewitching the river and causing general dampness. The new version read, Goody Thompson had a snarky tone and lived too close to a leaky stream. Our bad. Other updates included possessed sheep changed to untrained and cranky. Spectral butter sabotage removed entirely. A footnote under every case labeled "Oops." These revisions weren't just damage control. They were a quiet act of honesty. A way for the town to say, "We got swept up. We went too far. We tripped over our own fear and fell into the arms of our worst instincts." And once they said that out loud, even in town records, it changed something. There were fewer silences at dinner. More stories that started with, "Back then people really believed," instead of, "We don't talk about it." People even started writing songs about the trials. Not dramatic ballads, but little awkward, catchy tunes sung at harvest festivals. One popular one went like this: "If your pie won't rise, don't call the priest. Maybe it's just yeast or you forgot the beast." Of logic, yay, logic. Let's all use our heads before we end up chasing ghosts instead. The kids loved it. The adults cringed, but no one denied the truth of it. By now, Salem was no longer the town that accused people over burnt soup or weather-based moods. It was the town that looked at itself, chuckled, and decided it could do better. A new mural was painted in the town square, a giant mirror surrounded by flying hats and goats, with very neutral facial expressions. The words read, "When in doubt, ask twice, and maybe take a nap." It wasn't elegant, but it was real, because that's what Salem had learned the hard way. That silliness without reflection becomes cruelty, and that hysteria wears many disguises, sometimes even good intentions. They didn't need revenge, or erasure, or even perfect justice. They needed understanding of themselves, of each other, and of the ridiculous, beautiful, deeply human way fear makes fools of us all. So if you're ever walking through Old Salem and you feel a shiver or a twitch, or maybe the strange feeling that your oatmeal is judging you, don't panic. Just smile, take a breath, and remember, it was never really about witches. It was always just us. By the time Salem was able to really laugh at itself, something even stranger began to happen. Visitors started showing up. At first, it was just a trickle. Curious clergymen, wandering scholars, the occasional poet hoping to catch a glimpse of spiritual mayhem, or at least an angry ghost in a bonnet. But as whispers of Salem's bizarre past spread through nearby towns and colonies, the curious became a crowd. People arrived with wide eyes and questions like, where did the woman live who turned into a squirrel? Or, can I stand in the exact spot where the devil allegedly sneezed? Tourism, it seemed, had come to Salem. Now keep in mind, this was centuries before the invention of t-shirts and Instagram. So instead of selfies, visitors took home detailed sketches of ominous trees, pointy hats, and what one pamphlet called a genuine haunted fence post. The townspeople, initially confused, quickly realized they were sitting on a gold mine of ridiculousness. Soon, local businesses got creative. The blacksmith began selling spectrally safe horseshoes, guaranteed to ward off invisible goats and emotionally unstable spirits. A baker who had once been accused of pie sorcery began branding his pastries as bewitchingly good. He even created a new dessert called Trial by Custard. It sold out every Sunday. One innkeeper renamed her establishment the Spectral Inn, offering ghost-themed rooms like the Sobbing Spirit Suite and the Slightly Upset Chambermaid Chamber. She hired her nephew to creak around the hallway at night, wearing a sheet and whispering, "I'm full of regret." He won Employee of the Month 3 times. Even the town crier got in on the act, adjusting his daily announcements to include lines like, "Today's weather suspiciously cloudy with a 70% chance of overreaction." And so just like that, the town that once accused bread of spiritual misconduct became a destination for delightful nonsense. But underneath all the theatrical fog and homemade spirit repellent, something quietly remarkable was taking place. Salem wasn't just profiting from its past, it was processing it. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How we humans take the worst parts of our history, wrap them in ribbon, and turn them into stories that are almost safe to touch. We do it not to forget, but to survive, to soften the jagged edges. And Salem, of all places, understood that better than anyone. They weren't pretending the trials hadn't happened. No, they were saying yes. We lost our minds once, and now we're going to keep those minds busy with pie and laughter and the occasional extremely skeptical walking tour. The tours, by the way, became legendary. Local guides would walk groups through crooked streets at twilight, pausing dramatically by hedges and saying things like, "This is where Abigail claimed to see a floating shoe," or possibly a goose. The records are unclear. One guide, Old Thomas, was famous for ending every tour with the line, "Remember my friends." When you hear something outrageous, pause, breathe, and maybe don't set anyone on fire just yet. The visitors laughed, they clapped, they bought miniature gallows made of cinnamon sticks. And as they left, they took something else with them, a story. One that stuck in their heads, not because it was terrifying, but because it was true and sad and hilarious and oddly comforting, because it reminded them that humanity isn't made of perfect, rational beings. We are flawed, panicky, dramatic creatures who sometimes think our neighbor is a sorcerer just because they own 2 cats and make good soup. And that's okay, as long as we learn from it. As long as we remember to ask better questions, listen more closely, and maybe stop accusing people just because they look a little too confident during a thunderstorm. Over time, Salem's reputation shifted again. From that town, with the broomsticks and bad decisions, to that town, with the best history lessons wrapped in sarcasm and sourdough. Schools began sending field trips. Artists wrote plays. Satirists wrote pamphlets titled things like How Not to Summon Demons in 10 Easy Steps and Witch Trial Bingo, a game of red flags and regret. And through it all, the townspeople continued their lives planting gardens, baking pies, marrying people who probably weren't warlocks, and raising children who knew that truth was not always loud and fear not always wise. So if one day you find yourself in modern-day Salem, walking its narrow streets, beneath softly rattling trees, and you hear the distant jingle of a fake ghost bell or smell cinnamon from the Trial by Custard Bakery, pause, smile, and remember this is a town that once drowned itself in absurdity and then climbed back out, dusted itself off and said, let's bake this into something useful. That's not just recovery. That's magic. By the time Salem leaned into its oddball legacy with full theatrical flair, a curious, new kind of spirit had taken root in the town. Not the ghostly kind, though tour guides still whispered those into the wind for dramatic effect, but the spirit of self-aware silliness. Now, Salem wasn't just famous for its witch trials. It was becoming legendary for how comically aware it had been of them. In hindsight, local historians began publishing illustrated guides titled Oops, All Accusations and Witch Hunt, the Musical Not Recommended for Courtrooms. One clever fellow started selling trial-themed stationery with slogans like, from the desk of someone who has never turned into smoke, probably. This paper is certified 100% witch-free. At town meetings, people began referencing history in everyday decisions. Should we approve that new bakery license? Well, does she use raisins in her scones? She does. Okay. But let's not burn her this time. The laughter that followed wasn't mocking, it was a gentle, knowing chuckle, the kind that says, yes, we remember when we were ridiculous, but now we're ridiculous on purpose. In fact, the absurdity of the past became something of a community ritual. Every spring, Salem held the Festival of Slightly Haunted Misunderstandings. It featured a community play called Oops, There Goes the Logic, where the townspeople reenacted the trials, but all the witches were played by goats in tiny hats. A pie contest, where judges were encouraged to accuse the desserts of being unholy for being too flaky. A screaming booth for catharsis, where you could step inside and yell, I saw her spirit in my breakfast porridge, without consequences. It was healing in its own upside-down way. And not everything was jokes either. Some parts of the town took the past seriously, quietly, reverently. There was a small memorial garden tucked between 2 elm trees, where 19 simple stones bore the names of the executed. No tour groups, no plaques, just a place to sit and breathe and remember that behind every ridiculous accusation had been a real person, a person who once baked, laughed, worried, loved. The children of Salem, of course, grew up with all this half solemnity, half slapstick. Their history lessons were unlike anything taught in other towns, Instead of dusty lectures, they played games like Witch or Just Weird and trial trivia real or made up. They painted murals with labels like spectral evidence not a thing, and this is why we read books now. And they asked good questions too. Why did the grown-ups believe that? What does fear feel like in the brain? Would they have accused me for wearing too much yellow? Their teachers didn't dodge these questions. They leaned in. They explained that humans, when frightened and confused, often trade kindness for control. That when people don't understand something, they sometimes make up wild explanations, then double down because admitting they're wrong is scarier than any ghost. One student wrote an essay called, "I'm pretty sure my aunt would have been burned in 1692, and that's why I love her." It won the town's annual award for Best Historical Honesty and earned her a free pie. The town priest, now more therapist than fire and brimstone, preacher, gave gentle sermons about courage and curiosity. He wore shoes embroidered with tiny broomsticks, not out of mockery, but to remind people that feet which walked through fear could still dance afterward. Local merchants began naming shops after the town's oddest moments. There was the Bewitched Biscuit, a bakery where every receipt included a random, absurd accusation. You were seen speaking kindly to turnips, spectral socks and sundries. They only sold mismatched socks and claimed it protected wearers from judgmental spirits. And the very popular trial and error bookshop, where every book came with a bookmark shaped like a suspiciously judgmental cat. Even funerals, once solemn and straight-backed, gained a new tone. Eulogies included lines like, "She lived a good life, cast no curses, and left behind a cat that probably isn't magical, but we'll keep an eye on it anyway." Salem, in short, had become an emotional contradiction, a place of historic tragedy reinvented through humor reflection and commemorative jam jars. And outside the town, the legend of Salem spread not as a horror story, but as a moral comedy. Writers referenced it in plays. Philosophers used it as a case study in groupthink. Comedians delivered entire routines around the idea of being witch-trialed in modern life. There was even a viral letter passed between towns written in calligraphy that read, "To be accused of witchcraft in Salem, you need only 3 things: an opinion, an unfortunate mole, and a neighbor who hasn't had breakfast." Even the goats got in on it. One Salem farm hosted annual Witchy Goat Day, where children dressed their goats in little cloaks and held parades through the village. Prizes were awarded for most likely to be a familiar and goat with the most condemnable gaze. The irony of it all wasn't lost on the townsfolk. They understood that this silliness was born from a wound, and it could have gone another way, a darker way, one that denied, buried, or tried to pretend the trials had never happened. But Salem had chosen a different path. It had chosen to remember by reenacting, to honor by laughing, and to teach by admitting just how foolish we can be. Because sometimes the only way to heal from an absurd past is to become experts in purposeful absurdity. That doesn't mean the town forgot its dead or treated history lightly. It just meant that when the anniversary of the first trial came around each year, they'd ring a bell. Not solemnly, but curiously. Then someone would read out one ridiculous accusation from the old transcripts. Goody Haverhill was charged with causing a thunderstorm by singing badly, and then in unison the town would say, "Okay, but did anyone record the song?" And that was Salem's way. Not to rewrite the past, but to walk with it wearing comfortable shoes, mismatched socks, and an open mind. Because what happened in 1692 wasn't just history. It was a warning, a mirror, and, yes, a punchline. A way to remember that even in our most sincere moments, we are still just slightly evolved villagers with too many emotions and not enough critical thinking. And if that's not something to chuckle about, well, we're probably due for another goat parade. By now, Salem had embraced its past like an old sweater, slightly itchy, deeply familiar, and still carrying the faint scent of communal embarrassment. It was no longer the town of fear, but the town of we know better now. And that came with perks like humility tourism revenue and a surprisingly high number of goat-themed festivals. But here's the thing about historical absurdity. It's infinite fuel for storytelling. And Salem became the place where everyone told stories. In taverns over steaming cider and under wobbly lantern light, locals would reenact old testimonies for newcomers with dramatic flair. Picture it, the barkeep would say, pausing for maximum tension. Judge Hawthorne leans in and says, "Did the accused float or just sort of wobble?" Wobble, asks a wide-eyed traveler. Like a suspicious duck, someone else whispers from the corner. Laughter would ripple across the room, not cruel, but cathartic. A town that had once choked on its own hysteria now laughed, not to dismiss the past, but to make space for it in their hearts without letting it crush them. Even children got in on the act. They formed a ragtag performance troupe called the Tiny Tribunal. Once a month, they put on mock trials at the community barn. Everyone got involved. Someone played the stern judge, another the trembling accused, while the rest shouted wild accusations like, "She winked during church." His pumpkin glowed slightly at dusk. I saw her eat pie on a Wednesday. At the end of each play, the judge would bang a ladle on a stump and declare, "Not guilty." Just weird applause. Apples. Joy. And isn't that what it was always about? Because when you peel away the smoke and the superstition, the shouting and the shaky theology, what was really on trial back in 1692, it wasn't witchcraft. It was difference. It was curiosity. It was that one woman who read too much, or that man who didn't want to attend church 5 times a day. It was eccentricity misunderstood as evil. So the townspeople began collecting these differences. Literally. They created the Salem Museum of Oddness, an unassuming stone building filled with strange little exhibits, meant to honor all the things that might have once gotten you hanged. Some highlights included a collection of perfectly harmless birthmarks, photographed respectfully, a wall of suspicious hobbies like whistling while weaving or humming near soup, a hallway of cats in portraits, each named after someone historically wronged by superstition. One placard read, "This is Mr. Buttons. He once blinked at a candle and was blamed for a storm." There was even a permanent exhibit called The Room of Things We Overreacted To. Inside, a slightly burnt biscuit, a pair of pointy shoes, a mirror that made everyone look mildly suspicious if you squinted. Visitors loved it because it wasn't mocking the past, it was reclaiming it. Showing that fear loses power when you hold it up to the light, give it a name, and stick a funny hat on it. Meanwhile, in Salem schools, students learned history not through memorization, but participation. Each year, the town hosted the Day of Strange Thanks, where children were encouraged to dress as something that might have been feared during the trials. Books. Shadows introversion. Stand before their classmates and declare why being strange, curious, or skeptical was something worth celebrating. One girl, age 8, once stood tall and said, I ask a lot of questions, and that's why I'd be toast in 1692. The applause lasted 5 whole minutes. That day always ended with a parade, not a grand one, just a slow procession of oddballs and broomsticks and paper ghosts led by the oldest resident of Salem, who rode a decorated wagon and rang a little bell. And the bell's message, always the same: be kind to the weird ones. One day they'll save you from yourselves. Now, this isn't to say Salem was perfect. It still had its bickering, its long winters, and the occasional citizen who believed their cat understood Latin. But the core had shifted. The collective heartbeat of the town had gone from fearful thudding to a soft, curious hum, less courtroom, more campfire. And outside of Salem, people were taking notice. Universities studied the trials as the earliest known example of organized panic theater. Artists painted murals in tribute to those who had been condemned for quirks. Journalists came to write essays titled things like "The Town That Learned How to Laugh at Itself, but Took Centuries to Get There." Even other towns reached out asking for guidance on how to deal with their own embarrassing histories. One letter from a village in New Hampshire read, "We once jailed a man for sneezing on a goat." Advice Salem wrote back: start with a mural, then maybe a goat forgiveness festival, and slowly something lovely began to grow, not just in Salem, but in all the places it touched, a gentle acceptance that humans mess up, spectacularly, comedically, sometimes catastrophically. But what matters is what we do afterward. Do we bury it? Pretend it never happened? Or do we put it on stage, dust it with honesty, and let it teach us Salem chose the stage? The mural? The museum of misunderstood muffins? And that choice over time became its redemption. Because in a world constantly afraid of looking foolish, Salem stood proud and said, "We were fools, but now we are better fools. Fools who ask questions. Fools who admit when they've panicked. Fools who dance during thunderstorms just to prove they're still here, still human, still learning." And isn't that kind of wisdom the best kind? Not the stoic, polished marble statue kind, but the squishy mud on your shoes, laugh through tears kind. The kind that turns a history of horror into a future of hope. The kind that makes you say, well, at least we don't burn people for blinking anymore. By the time the calendar rolled forward into a new century, Salem had evolved from a place of panic into something far more rare and delightful, a town that could admit it had lost its mind once and had learned to laugh, cry, and make incredibly good scones because of it. And with each passing year, the stories got better. Not because they were polished or mythologized, but because they were told by people who understood the importance of being a little ridiculous. You see, Salem had become a town of storytellers, not just historians or tour guides, but everyday folks. The baker with flour in her eyebrows, the blacksmith who forged horseshoes while humming sea shanties, the retired trial reenactor who now ran a quiet tea garden called the Mildly Bewitched Leaf. Everyone had a version of the story. Some would say it started with 2 girls faking fainting spells. That's it. That's the match that lit the bonfire. Others insisted, no, it was the Reverend, all brimstone and bad posture, got everyone riled up like a cat in a rainstorm. And a few, the boldest, would say, I think we just got bored. Honestly, life was hard. Our bread was dry. And one day we decided to spice things up by accusing each other of soul crimes. That last theory was surprisingly popular. One librarian even hosted a discussion series titled, Was it Satan or seasonal affective disorder, packed every week standing room only. People would sip tea and earnestly debate the psychological toll of long winters and bad shoes on mass delusion. And through all the telling and retelling, something beautiful happened. The town remembered what it had forgotten back in 1692, how to hold space for strange things. Things like people who talked to their plants, dreams that didn't follow the rules, songs hummed off-key but with great passion, women who read books upside down just to confuse their cats. These were no longer signs of witchcraft. They were signs of life, and that made all the difference. In fact, every autumn Salem began a new tradition, the Parade of Peculiars. It was part celebration, part group therapy, and all charming chaos. Everyone dressed up not in costumes, but in versions of themselves that might have gotten them accused back in the day. One woman wore a giant hat covered in question marks. A man dressed entirely in purple velvet and handed out pamphlets titled "Things I Believe That Are Only Slightly Dangerous." Children wore sandwich boards that read, "I ask why too much. I giggle during storms. I like frogs more than people." And the best part? No one was punished for it. They were applauded. Floats rolled down the cobbled streets, shaped like giant spoons cauldrons full of rubber ducks, and one magnificent tribute to the bread that was too fluffy to be natural. At the head of the parade walked the town's oldest living resident, Miss Clarity Barnes, who at 97 had a birthmark shaped like the moon and had been accused of being slightly too mysterious in her youth. Every year she wore the same cloak and rang the same bell, whispering to the crowd, "Let us never confuse mystery with malice again." And the crowd would cheer, not just because she was wise, but because she was right. Because what had Salem learned really? Not just that witch hunts are bad, that's obvious, but that the real danger wasn't belief in witches. It was the absence of curiosity. It was the certainty that made people say, "I know exactly what's happening and it's bad and you're the reason." The certainty that left no room for nuance or silliness or off-key songs in the dark. So Salem had committed to a life of glorious uncertainty. Instead of burning what they didn't understand, they built shelves for it. They labeled it. They studied it. Sometimes they knitted hats for it. They kept archives of mysteries we've decided not to solve just yet, including why the weather vane on the town hall always pointed southwest, even during nor'easters. The identity of the midnight banjo player, how the town's oldest oak tree sometimes smelled faintly of cinnamon. Not everything needed to be explained. Some things were just delightfully odd, and the townsfolk were okay with that. They even developed a school curriculum unit titled "The Art of Not Jumping to Conclusions." It taught kids how to say, I need more information. And that's interesting, but let's not light anything on fire just yet. Their final project was a debate on whether a haunted sandwich should be blamed for a bad picnic. Most kids concluded it was probably just mayonnaise. Now you might be wondering, did the town ever slip back into old habits? Occasionally, sure. There was that one time a neighbor's rooster started crowing in Latin, or so it sounded, and someone panicked and ran to the bell tower shouting, "It's back." But instead of a trial, the town brought the rooster a music teacher. Problem solved, because Salem had learned to respond, not react, to breathe before shouting, to laugh before condemning, to listen especially when someone said something weird, and most importantly, to celebrate the weird, because the weird was what had saved them. It was the curious souls, the stubborn readers, the laughing skeptics, The ones who asked uncomfortable questions and refused to sit still through madness, those were the people who had helped Salem emerge from its own darkness. They weren't witches. They were just human beings with inconvenient brilliance. And so each year, under a sky full of drifting leaves and floating laughter, Salem said a quiet thank you, not just to the ones who survived, but to the ones who dared to be strange, who wore their questions like badges, who refused to be burned by someone else's confusion, because when the fire had faded, it wasn't fear that remained. It was resilience, wrapped in whimsy, sprinkled with cinnamon, and served with a side of sarcastic jam. There comes a point in every town's story, if it's lucky, when the past finally stops dragging behind like an old squeaky cart full of regrets, and instead begins to walk beside you, offering quiet wisdom and the occasional sarcastic comment. That was Salem. Not perfect, not guiltless, but finally at peace with its peculiar shadow. And perhaps no one captured this transformation better than the town's unofficial philosopher, a retired candle maker named Mr. Elias Thistle. Elias lived in a crooked house with a cat named Consequence, and a habit of writing notes to himself like, "Don't fear the fog, it's just weather with flair. Witchcraft, being slightly good at gardening. If you forget history, it will come back, wearing a fake mustache, and embarrass you." Every Thursday he held philosophy in pajamas at the public hall. Townsfolk would gather in slippers with mugs of tea, and Elias would begin each session with a line like, "Tonight, we ask, why did our ancestors believe in witches? And more importantly, were any of them just trying to avoid doing the dishes?" Laughter, discussion, and reflection would follow, sometimes heated, sometimes hilarious, always heartfelt. Elias's goal wasn't to explain away the past, but to unwrap it carefully, like an old gift someone once feared was cursed. He reminded them all that the real legacy of Salem wasn't the trials. It was the resilience that came after, the slow, stubborn return to rational thought, the rediscovery of kindness, the ability to say, "That was absurd, and I was part of it. Let me try again." And oh, how they tried. They tried when they turned their town square into a place of celebration instead of accusation. They tried when they taught children how to ask better questions instead of just louder ones. They tried when they made room for the lonely, the eccentric, the unsure. And they tried when they painted each year a new mural on the side of the library titled simply "What We've Learned So Far." Each year's version was different, sometimes a forest of question marks, sometimes a trail of hats tossed away in the wind. One year it was just a giant loaf of bread with eyes, the message still unclear. But maybe that was the point, because not everything needed to be nailed down anymore. Salem had grown comfortable with uncertainty, with nuance, with letting things breathe before declaring them dangerous. And maybe that's why it began to inspire other towns. Letters poured in from places near and far, with lines like, "We once accused a widow of speaking to her lamp too affectionately. How did you forgive yourselves? Our town held a public meeting about suspicious goats. Any advice? Is there a polite way to tell my neighbor that I don't think her tea is cursed just bad?" Salem always answered with grace and gentle humor. They sent pamphlets like "The Beginner's Guide to Not Panicking." Even when things are weird, fear is not a fact, but it is loud things that seem magical, but are just good lighting. And with each response, they spread not just their story, but their recovery. Because the truth is, Salem had not just survived its own history, it had transformed it. What began as a tale of fear and fire had become a fable of emotional evolution. One that said, you can mess up spectacularly. You can ruin things hurt. People believe terrible ideas, but if you own it, truly own it, you can rebuild something better, something honest, something weird, something kind. So when people visited Salem now, they didn't just come for ghost stories. They came to feel the energy of a town that had forgiven itself. They walked through the Witch Trials Memorial and left behind poems, apologies, bouquets of sage and notes that read, I once judged my sister for loving astrology. I'm sorry. This is for every woman who laughed too loud and was told to hush. Thank you for reminding us that being wrong is human and healing is allowed. And in the evenings, as lanterns flickered along cobbled paths, you might hear music drifting through the air, not haunting but hopeful. A fiddler on a porch playing a tune called Broomsticks and Second Chances. Teenagers harmonizing on a bench. If I twitch my eye, don't tie me up might just be pollen or dumb. Bad luck. Even the wind seemed softer now, less judgmental, more curious. It swirled around the chimneys, rustled the scarves of tourists, nudged the shutters like it wanted in on the conversation. And in that breeze you could almost hear Salem whispering, we were foolish, we were cruel, and now we are learning. That whisper is still there. It lives in the town's annual forgiveness parade, where people dress up not as witches or ghosts, but as themselves at their worst, and walk forward anyway. It lives in the bookstore shelf labeled Speculative Silliness, next to the local history section. It lives in the bakery's tip jar, which reads, Don't curse the cook, tip the pie. And maybe most of all, it lives in the eyes of every Salem resident who has ever paused, taken a breath, and decided, this time I'll ask a better question, because that's how you break a spell, not with fire or salt or muttered incantations, but with a moment of stillness, a breath, a choice. And Salem, once a town that shouted, now knew how to do something even more magical. It knew how to listen. And so Salem, this once quiet village that had once thundered with suspicion and shame, had become something far rarer than a cursed town or a haunted headline. It had become a gentle example, not of moral perfection, but of what happens when a place and its people decide to be more curious than afraid. The townspeople didn't claim to be wise. They weren't saints. They were quirky, occasionally cranky, prone to long-winded metaphors and baking too many kinds of scones. But they had developed something stronger than certainty. They had developed humility wrapped in humor. The children who used to be taught to memorize court transcripts now learned how to role-play what not to do when your neighbor's candle blows out suspiciously. One child's class project was titled 10 Reasons Why My Aunt is Not a Witch, even though she talks to her broom, and the teacher's comment, strong arguments. Try interviewing the broom next time. In Salem's town library, there was now an entire section dedicated to books about hysteria, empathy, and groupthink, filed under a hand-painted sign that simply read, So we don't do that again. One popular checkout was How to Love a Town That Has a Messy Past, written by a local poet named Clementine Frost. It included chapters like Forgiving Your Grandfather, Who Swore the Wind Was Up to Something. Yes, you can still plant herbs without summoning spirits. Why your cat is not a familiar, but may still be judging you. It sold out 3 times in paperback. Across town there was a bakery named Better Than Blame, their signature cookie. The oopsie biscuit, slightly misshapen, always delicious, served with a small scroll containing a real quote from a historical trial. One read, "She turned my soup sour with a glare." Customers were invited to respond in writing and hang their answers on a wall titled, "What We Could Have Said Instead." Some of the best responses: "Maybe the soup just needed more salt." Or maybe you're projecting, Steve. Have you considered not blaming the witch next time? And that was the thing. Salem didn't erase what it had done. It simply learned how to sit beside it like an old companion who had once thrown a tantrum and knocked over the dinner table. Now they were both older, wiser, more comfortable with awkward silences. Even town celebrations had changed. Where once there were fire and brimstone sermons, now there were storytelling nights. By the bonfire, laughter echoing between the trees as people recounted absurdities from the past. Like the time a man swore his goat was possessed because it refused to climb stairs. Or the woman who claimed her neighbor controlled the rain with her sighs. Or that one highly suspicious moment in 1692 when someone fainted just because they saw a squirrel wearing a leaf on its head. These stories were shared with affection, not to mock, but to marvel, because in each tale was the reminder, we have always been a little ridiculous, but we can choose not to let our fear drive the cart. At the town's annual Weird and Wonderful Walk, each citizen wore a sign around their neck that said something they might have been accused of 300 years ago. Some were poignant, others were downright delightful. I like books more than people. I painted my fence teal, and now the pastor's confused. I invented a new dance. It scared a horse. I dreamed loudly. No one was judged. Everyone was cheered. And if you were lucky enough to stay in town long enough, someone might invite you to the most sacred of Salem traditions, the midnight listening. It wasn't advertised. There were no costumes or chants, just a circle of people, old, young, unsure, brave, sitting on the grass beneath a gentle sky, listening to the night. No accusations, no conclusions, just stories. One by one, people would stand and speak. A fear they'd had, a time they'd been wrong, a person they had misunderstood. And the rest would listen, not to fix, not to shame, not to correct, but to hold space. Because Salem had finally understood the real opposite of hysteria isn't silence, it's compassionate listening. It's the space between judgment and forgiveness where truth has room to unfold. It's what the town had needed all along, and there under the stars with the wind, no longer whispering accusations, but humming lullabies, the people of Salem remembered what it meant to be flawed and human and okay with both. Because they knew now that magic was never the danger. The real danger was certainty without kindness. So they let go of the need to be right. They let go of the need to make sense of every whisper. And in that release, something quietly beautiful happened. They became the kind of town where you could be odd without being ostracized, where you could bake strange pies and write awkward poetry and talk to trees and still be invited to the town potluck, where forgiveness wasn't just a word carved in stone, but a rhythm woven into every handshake, every laugh, every awkward explanation of why your scarf smells like cloves and regret. Salem had become not just a town that had survived history, but one that had rewritten its ending. It was the kind of quiet most people didn't notice at first, a gentle stillness that had settled over Salem like a worn quilt. Not the eerie silence of fear like in the old days, but the comforting hush that comes when a place no longer flinches at its own reflection. By now, Salem had become a whispering town where even the shadows seemed a little less sharp, a little more curious. You could feel it most clearly at dawn, when the fog slipped between the chimneys like a thoughtful ghost trying not to knock over the flower pots. The streets once filled with cries of accusation now echoed only with the soft shuffles of morning walkers and the occasional clink of a bakery bell. The townspeople had taken their history and folded it gently into everyday life like sourdough starter alive, pungent and occasionally confusing to outsiders, but essential nonetheless. There were no more tribunals, no more trials, no more breathless declarations of guilt based on teacup temperature or the emotional aura of a sneeze. But there were reminders. Each home kept something: an old hat, a painting of an odd-shaped potato, once accused of harboring spirits, a handwritten apology from someone's great-great-great-uncle who once testified that a neighbor was definitely a witch because she hummed in Latin. She was actually humming in a made-up language from her dreams. These reminders weren't there to haunt. They were there to anchor, because Salem knew better than anyone: a place without memory is a place without wisdom. And what Salem now had in spades was wisdom, deep, wonky, heartfelt wisdom, earned not from books or sermons, but from living with its own mistakes and choosing over and over again to be kinder the next day. Tourists still came by the wagon load, sure. They wore their little witch hats and bought cursed cookies and specter-free soap and asked questions like, where did the first trial take place? Do you believe in ghosts? Can I stand where the judge once misread a sneeze as an omen? But those who stayed a little longer, who lingered in the stillness, who asked better questions, were sometimes led to the quietest corner of the town. The Listening Rock. No plaque, no arrows, just a flat, moss-draped stone under a tree that leaned a little too dramatically westward. This was where people went not to speak, but to listen to the wind, to the birds, to themselves. Locals believed that the Listening Rock had once heard it all: the first scream, the last apology, the long, uncertain silence in between. And now it had only one rule: bring your weirdness, leave your judgment. Sometimes people brought journals and wrote down what they were too afraid to say aloud. One note found beneath the rock read, I was raised to fear everything strange. I'm trying not to anymore. Another, I used to laugh at people who wore cloaks. Now I wear one when I bake. It helps. And the most common note of all, thank you for proving that places can change. Because Salem had changed. Not overnight, not in grand speeches, but in 1,000 small decisions made by people who decided they were tired of fear, of shame, of looking over their shoulder every time someone coughed with intention. And it was those small decisions that had turned Salem from a town that once ate its own heart into a town that offered tea and asked, would you like to tell your story? In fact, the final hour of each week was reserved for something special at the town hall, the Circle of Second Thoughts. No podium, no hierarchy. Just a circle of chairs, a pot of ginger tea, and one question. What did you once believe that you've since reconsidered? The answers were often funny. That my neighbor was sending messages through her laundry. The goats were naturally evil. That I'd never be forgiven for that one bad idea. And sometimes the answers made everyone quiet in that lovely, important way that silence does when it's holding space for something real. Because Salem no longer measured itself by how loudly it could shout. It measured itself by how well it could listen. And that more than anything else became its legacy. Not the trials, not the gallows, not the stories of haunted windows or floating muffins, but the gentle, persistent practice of choosing understanding over certainty. And what a beautiful legacy that was. Because if a town like Salem could evolve, could learn to laugh without mocking, to remember without shame, to honor its history without repeating it, then maybe any place could. Maybe even us. Maybe we too could learn to pause when someone says something strange instead of labeling it dangerous. Maybe we could remember to ask better questions even of ourselves. Maybe we could stop demanding that the world make sense all the time and instead accept that some things are just odd, and that's okay. Maybe we could be a little more like Salem, a little more curious, a little more forgiving, a little more weird, and a whole lot more human. Because in the end, the greatest spell Salem ever cast was learning how to be kind to its own foolishness. And what could be more magical than that? And now, dear listener, as your eyelids begin to soften and your breath slows into the rhythm of still water, let's leave Salem, right where it belongs, not in fear, not in flames, but in peace. A town that once trembled at shadows now walks with them. A people who once saw danger in every quirk now see possibility. They've taught us that history isn't something you escape. It's something you hold gently in your hands, like an awkwardly shaped stone. You turn it over, you feel its rough edges. You say, yes, this was us. But it's not all we are. And in doing so, you find that the cracks aren't just damage. They're places where the light got in, where the laughter returned, where the healing began. So if you find yourself tonight lying in bed, your mind swirling with strange thoughts, questions, maybe even dreams that make no sense, don't worry. You're not cursed. You're just human. And being human is weird, delightfully weird, just like Salem. So let the wind outside whisper its stories. Let the shadows on the wall do their little dance. Let your thoughts drift through forests of what if and maybe not. There are no judges here, no accusations, only stories, only questions, only the soft magic of not knowing everything and learning to rest anyway. Good night, traveler of time. Sleep well beneath the leaves of curiosity. And if you dream of witches, make sure they're laughing,